Imagine now that you are lying beneath a weight of wool that holds not only warmth, but silence. It is early morning in an Edwardian bedroom, the kind where the ceiling slopes gently with the pitch of the roof, where the wallpaper curls just slightly at the corners, and the only light enters faintly timid, like a guest unsure of its welcome. The window is a thin barrier, its single pane turned opaque with frost. Inside, your breath hovers before your lips like a ghost, unsure of its place. The fire that crackled the night before has long surrendered to the cold, leaving behind a quiet, ashen shell and the faint scent of last night's embers. There is no central hum, no quiet rush of heating. Warmth in this world is fleeting, earned, not assumed. You are not alone. All across Edwardian towns and countryside, in cottages with sagging beams and in tall, narrow row houses with polished brass knockers, millions wake in much the same condition. The first awareness is not of light or sound, but of air, how it bites the skin, how it stiffens fingers before thought has even caught up to movement. Beds are sanctuaries, heavily layered with quilts, with coverlets handed down from mothers to daughters, stitched in winters past. Often, the weight is deliberate, not only to retain heat, but to press gently against the sleeper, comforting like the embrace of a remembered lullaby. The bed may have a warming pan laid under the sheets the night before, its copper belly filled with embers, but its heat has faded now, leaving only the memory of care. The rhythm of morning begins in stillness. A servant girl may wake before all others, her feet hesitating on the bare boards before they dart into worn slippers. The air is not just cold, it is a presence in the room, something to be reckoned with. She lights a candle, not because she cannot see, but because it makes the shadows feel less brittle. She moves with practiced quiet toward the hearth, crouching low, blowing life into last night's coals. Sometimes they catch, glowing orange like shy eyes in the dark. Sometimes they do not. And so she begins again, coaxing flame from tinder, fingers red and raw even before the sun has risen. In middle-class homes, the man of the house might wake to the sound of clinking outside his bedroom door, the tray being laid, the soft rustle of newspaper folded just so, the whistle of kettle water beginning to boil downstairs. But for many others, there is no such ritual. Waking is a solitary act, done not with ceremony but resignation. It is not about rising to embrace the day, but about leaving behind the brief refuge of warmth for the sharp truth of necessity. Feet touch the floor with a wince, finding linoleum cold as stone. Clothes are not laid out for you. They must be warmed by the fire, or simply pulled on, stiff and cool from the peg. Underthings are buttoned with trembling fingers, stockings rolled up over half-numb legs. The shirt is not fresh, it was worn yesterday, and the day before that. Laundry in winter is an ordeal reserved for later. There is water in a pitcher by the wash basin, a thin film of ice glinting at the surface. The first shock of it on your face is enough to take your breath. But you do it anyway, quickly, without drama. This is not a world of indulgence. Cleanliness is a habit, not a pleasure. Hair is combed, teeth are brushed, cheeks are slapped to bring life to them. And throughout all of it, you can see your breath. You do not speak, because conversation in these first moments would break something fragile. It is a communion between person and season, and it must be observed in silence. In homes with children, the morning is orchestrated chaos. A mother pulls layers over sleepy heads, coaxes reluctant limbs into stiff uniforms. The stove must be lit before breakfast can begin, but coal is precious, and the fire must be made to last. There are mittens to find, scarves to wind, boots to button. And there is always one child who has grown too fast, whose sleeves now hover at the wrists like they're afraid to touch the skin. The mother notices, makes a mental note to let down the hem of the coat again tonight, after the children are asleep, and the mending basket comes out with its familiar sigh. Outside, the world is still holding its breath. streets are empty, but for the milkman's cart, the rattle of bottles a quiet punctuation against the hush of snow. He walks with quick, confident steps, his hands chapped but practiced, lifting each bottle with the care of a man who knows he is delivering more than milk. He is delivering continuity, the ordinary rhythm of an otherwise difficult season. At the corner, a paper boy whistles to himself to keep warm, each note a puff of vapor in the morning gloom. He moves fast, not out of energy, but necessity. The quicker he finishes, the sooner he can wrap his hands around something hot. Further out, in villages hemmed by hedgerows and hollow trees, morning begins earlier still. Farmers do not have the luxury of slow starts. The cows must be milked before the frost softens, and the animals fed before their breath draws too deep from empty bellies. A man might step into his boots with a grunt, shrug into a coat that has never quite dried, and tug his cap down over ears already pink from cold. The barn is dark and sweet with the smell of hay and animals. His lantern swings with a rhythm that matches his steps, lighting one thing, and then another, the back of a sleeping cow, a rope pulley, a sack of oats. There is no coffee here, no to-go cups, no central heating to hold the frost at bay. And yet, in these early Edwardian hours, there is a kind of sacredness. Time is not rushed. It unfolds slowly, gently, as though unwilling to shatter the quiet. In the kitchen, a pot simmers low on the stove, perhaps porridge, thick and steady, stirred with a wooden spoon that has known 100 winters. A sliver of bread warms beside it. The butter is too cold to spread, so it is left on the side to soften, glistening like pale wax. By now, windows begin to glow. Curtains are pulled back just slightly, enough to let in the meager daylight. Frost clings to the glass in patterns like delicate etchings, each pane a lacework of winter's hand. In the parlor, a man might warm his hands over the fire, newspaper open but unread, eyes distant. Outside, footsteps mark the snow like notes on a blank page. Life begins to pick up its rhythm, but quietly. The day has begun. In the cities, chimneys begin to smoke, sending threads of gray into the pale sky. Shopkeepers unlock their doors, breath rising in visible curls as they inspect their wares, nudge coal into small grates at the back of their shops. A tailor straightens bolts of cloth with stiff fingers. A bookseller rubs the glass of his display with the corner of his sleeve, revealing a row of titles that wait patiently to be chosen. The city is not yet awake in full, but it is stirring. Even the horse-drawn omnibuses move with less clatter in the snow, their wheels muffled, their passengers silent. There is something poetic in the slowness of it all. Edwardian mornings were not rushed affairs, punctuated by screens and alarms and deadlines. They were rituals sometimes difficult, always repeated, always known. In a way, the cold sharpened awareness. Every movement mattered. You did not dawdle, but neither did you rush. You moved through the cold like a conversation deliberate, respectful, resilient. And now, as the last coals are stoked, as the children prepare for school, as the city begins to pulse with quiet purpose, the morning ends not with a crescendo, but with a sigh. The frost remains on the windows, but inside, life is moving forward, slowly, steadily. The Edwardians, whether they woke to comfort or to hardship, all met the same cold. And in meeting it, they shaped the rhythm of a world where winter was not an inconvenience to be avoided, but a season to be lived through honestly, simply, and with a kind of daily courage that required no fanfare. And so, the morning closes. A moment in time frozen and fading, passed down not through grand histories, but through quiet habits, through the way a hand hovered over a flame, the way boots found their way to the door, the way a mother's voice softened even when her fingers were cold. The Edwardian winter morning was not a spectacle. It was a whisper. And if you listen closely, even now, you might still hear its echo. To truly understand the Edwardian winter, one must step not only through the door, but all the way to the heart of the home, toward the hearth, the fire, the breath of the house itself. It was there, in the red glow and slow crackle, that warmth was not merely generated but shared, revered, even protected. The hearth was more than functional. It was spiritual. A kind of glowing silence that held back the encroaching cold, not only with heat, but with presence. To sit near the fire was to reclaim part of yourself lost in the frost of early morning, to draw close to something alive, and loyal to watch it flicker and settle into its own quiet rhythm like a familiar lullaby. The Edwardians, like their forebears, understood fire with an intimacy that few modern minds recall. It was not just something to be turned on or adjusted. It was coaxed, cared for, sustained. Fire needed tending the way a child might need gentle nudging, with kindling laid just so, with breath and patience, and the ear for crackle that told you when the flame had taken hold. In cottages with low ceilings and soot-stained mantels, a small grate might warm a kitchen no larger than a pantry, and yet that single blaze could draw the family in, could shape the entire layout of evening. In larger homes, each room might boast its own fireplace ornate, with mantels of carved wood or marble, but even there, the fire was a precious resource. Its light a signal that this room was meant to be inhabited, not simply passed through. The coal that fed these fires was both common and dear. It came in sacks delivered by men with blackened faces and shoulders, strong from lifting coalmen who left smudges on fences and received few thanks, yet made survival possible. Coal dust settled into the cracks of everyday life, clinging to hands and under fingernails, its scent mingling with that of cabbage, candle wax, and wet wool. Children learned early how to fetch coal from the scuttle, to handle the shovel without wasting, to mind the draft so the fire didn't choke or spit. Housewives became artists of efficiency, banking the coals at night to keep the ember's heart alive until morning. To let the fire go out completely was not just a nuisance. It was a small failure that cost time, effort, and the bite of the morning chill. Yet warmth was never truly evenly shared. In many homes, the fire belonged to a single room, the kitchen, usually where it did double duty as heat source and cooking flame. The rest of the house remained in various degrees of cold, rooms closed off with thick curtains or wooden doors, windows stuffed at the sill with newspaper or cloth to keep the drafts at bay. Upstairs, bedrooms often had no heat at all. Warmth was layered in the body socks pulled over socks, shawls draped around the shoulders, hot water bottles tucked under the knees, and blankets piled in such number that to move beneath them felt like shifting beneath earth itself. In these rooms, the air was not much warmer than the world outside, but the illusion of comfort lived in the closeness, in the shared understanding that winter was not to be conquered, only endured with quiet grace. At the center of Edwardian home life, then, was not simply a fire, but a choreography around it. Chairs were pulled close, knees angled toward the glow. Conversations slowed, and voices softened as if mimicking the gentle rhythm of the coals. A mother might mend a sock with eyes half closed, her needle rising and falling like breath. A father might stir his tea absently, lost in the movement of flame, the steam from his cup joining the quiet plume from the hearth. Children sat cross-legged, their fingers sticky with molasses biscuit or buried in wool, their cheeks pink from the earlier cold now beginning to fade. Even silence felt warm here. There was no need to fill every moment with speech. The fire did the speaking, in hisses and sighs, in the occasional sharp snap of sap meeting heat, a gentle punctuation in a room otherwise subdued. In wealthier homes, hearths grew in grandeur. Grates of polished brass reflected light in golden curls. Logs were carefully stacked by uniformed staff, the flames tended with precision more akin to ritual than routine. Yet even there, despite the elegance, fire remained a central character, equal parts necessity and display. It was a sign that the household was running properly, that staff were attentive, that the family need not feel the edge of winter too sharply. A guest offered a seat near the fire was being given something more than warmth. They were being welcomed into intimacy, into the quiet, soft-bellied center of domestic life. In the evenings, as light faded, the role of the hearth became even more pronounced. It drew people inward, turned houses into sanctuaries. Meals were eaten near its glow, not because it was tradition, but because it felt safe. In rural homes, families would tell stories in its flickering company stories that wandered as gently as the shadows on the walls. In cities, parlors might be filled with the low sound of a piano, its player careful not to compete with the fire, but rather accompany it. Heat, music, and light wove together, lulling the evening into something soft and forgettable, something that blurred the lines between memory and dream. Even the smells were part of the warmth. The scent of burning peat or softwood mixed with drying laundry strung across the mantel. In many households, clothes were aired by the hearth overnight, their fabrics warming slowly, releasing the faint aroma of soap or damp wool. A cat curled in the ashbox, purring low. A kettle steamed gently. And above all, the fire remained, watching, moving, dimming perhaps, but never vanishing completely. It was a companion, a confidant, and most of all a silent reminder that the cold outside had not yet won. But warmth was not only measured in degrees, it was measured in closeness, in the bodies drawn together for comfort. A family pressed shoulder to shoulder on a narrow settee, sharing not only heat but presence. A young child tucked under the arm of a grandparent, listening not to stories, but to the heartbeat, the breath, the hum of life sustained. In this way, the hearth did more than warm, it bound. It held people near one another when the world outside pushed them apart. When snow thickened and winds rose, and the sky itself seemed made of slate, the fire offered an unspoken promise, not of perfection, not even of ease, but of endurance, of something held together through routine, affection, and the silent power of habit. Still, it is worth remembering that the warmth of Edwardian homes was not universal. For every household gathered round a glowing grate, there were others with no fire at all. Poor families in London's East End or in Scotland's damp tenements might rely on a single room to shelter them, the warmth of bodies doing more than bricks or blankets ever could. In those places, heat was an aspiration, a luxury glimpsed through windows or imagined in dreams. Children might press their hands against a neighbor's wall just to feel the warmth seep through. Charities would sometimes distribute coal in sacks no larger than a cat, and those few lumps might be saved for a single evening Christmas, perhaps, or a day when illness made even cold feel crueler. In such homes, ingenuity took the place of fire. Bricks were heated in communal ovens and wrapped in cloth to bring home to bed. Soup kitchens offered more than food. They offered a moment of warmth, a chance to thaw not only limbs but spirits. And yet, even in these hardest places, people found ways to hold one another, to share what little heat they could conjure. The hearth might be metaphorical, but it burned all the same. As night settled once again over Edwardian Britain, the fire dimmed slowly, shrinking into itself like a flower folding at dusk. Coals were banked, flues closed, ashes raked just so. The room darkened not all at once, but in shades as candles flickered low and lanterns hissed their last. Still, the hearth lingered even in sleep. In the dreams of children, in the quiet exhale of resting adults, in the soot-dusted bricks that held the memory of 100 evenings past. And so it is that in understanding how Edwardians kept warm, we understand more than the mechanisms of heat. We begin to understand the quiet choreography of survival, of comfort, of the deeply human need to gather close and endure together. Not every fire was bright, not every hearth was grand, but in each there burned a steady reminder that within the coldest seasons of life, warmth can still be kindled, tended, and shared. If warmth was the pulse of an Edwardian winter, Then food was its breath drawn slowly, measured carefully, and always tied to the rhythms of the earth and the quiet demands of the season. As the days shortened and the ground hardened, the gathering of nourishment became both ritual and reality, threading its way through every class and corner of life. The Edwardians, whether noble or impoverished, did not wait to pantries stocked with abundance or the convenience of delivery. Their meals were built not just from appetite, but from memory, from preparation, from the steady work of fetching, planning, preserving. In the hush of a winter morning, the scent of boiled oats or bread, just turned golden in the oven, became not only sustenance, but sanctuary. It was not simply about being fed. It was about being sustained through something cold and long and deeply communal. Walk with me now, slowly, into the heart of a frosted Edwardian market town. Imagine the square, cobbled and glistening with melt, where footsteps have already passed. The shops lining its edges, where the season like an old scarf frost, clinging to windows. Wooden signage dulled by damp. A butcher's block stands proudly in one corner, the meat behind the glass dark and heavy, marked by hand-painted signs. The baker's door opens and closes with a soft, repetitive thud. Each visitor bringing with them a chill is quickly swallowed by the thick warmth of yeast and rising dough. In the grocer's shop, bins of root vegetables sit quietly beneath dim lamps, their skins still marked with traces of the soil from which they were pulled. Nothing gleams here. Nothing pretends to be what it is not. These are honest foods, humble and rough-edged, meant to survive not only time but weather. The people who buy them move carefully, their coin purses often lighter than they would like. Winter makes everything dearer, everything slower. A woman fingers a potato with thoughtful intent, turning it over as if measuring it not only for taste, but for how long it might last when boiled into soup. A child asks about apples, but they are few now, and browning. Instead, dried fruits and preserved jams fill shelves behind glass, their jeweled colors catching what little light filters through the misted window panes. Sugar is a comfort here, an indulgence, but also a weapon against cold and fatigue. It is stirred into weak tea, baked into dense puddings, spread sparingly on bread thick with butter. Not every meal is rich, but every meal tries, in its own way, to warm. And beyond the shop fronts, in alleys and streets just a little darker, the fuel merchants move with carts of coal and barrows of kindling. Their hands are soot-stained, their breath pluming upward in clouds of quiet labor. They call their wares with little voice, their energy saved for the work itself. Coal is weighed and bagged, often in amounts too small to be called sufficient. Firewood is bundled in string-short logs, chopped roughly, their bark still clinging, the scent of forest barely visible beneath the frost. Each piece is a promise of warmth, each pile a brief reprieve. People barter, sometimes not with money, but with goods, with services, with favors, remembered from summers now long past. A neighbor offers jam in return for timber. A seamstress exchanges mending for a sack of anthracite. The winter market is not just an exchange of goods, but of endurance. In rural places, food is a quieter presence, but no less precious. The earth has given what it can, and now it rests. Cellars are full of jars pickled beets, spiced apples, rhubarb preserved in syrup, so sweet it might last until spring. Potatoes hibernate in straw-lined bins. Onions hang in braids. There are no strawberries in January. No tomatoes unless tinned. What is eaten is what has survived, and those who eat it understand that this survival is both botanical and human. Bread is baked from flour, measured by the handful. Butter is churned only as often as the cream allows. Milk is precious, eggs rarer still, and meat, when it appears, is the centerpiece not only of the table, but of conversation, of reverence. The meal itself is a slow event. In humble homes, soup simmers low for hours, its flavor drawn from bones and scraps, from cabbage leaves that curled at the edges and carrots beginning to fade. The aroma fills the small space with comfort, steam rising to meet window panes already opaque with condensation. Bread is torn, not sliced. It is dipped, not wasted. Children learn to eat not just for fullness, but for fuel. There is little room for preference. A full belly is enough. Around the table, conversation may be limited to what must be said. Chores still to do. Tasks not yet finished. The weather's progress. The state of the coal. But the silence is not empty. It is full of presence, of purpose. Every clink of spoon and scrape of bowl is an act of defiance against the cold. In homes of means, meals wear more ceremony, but beneath the lace doilies and fine silver, the same logic applies. The season determines the menu. A roast might grace the table, served with root vegetables glazed in drippings, but the preparation began long before. Kitchens bustle with quiet precision. Maids peel, scullions stir, cooks direct with the authority of generals. The dining room, warmed by firelight and candle glow, bears the illusion of abundance. But even here, scarcity is understood. Game is prized. Preserved summer fruits are cherished. And behind each serving lies the careful planning of a household that must appear effortless. Fuel, like food, is stored with intent. In the outbuildings of manors and in the lean-tos of village homes, stacks of coal sit beneath canvas. Bundles of kindling are tied and stored high to avoid damp. The gathering of such supplies is not merely chore, it is tradition. Children carry wood into the scullery. Teenagers shovel coal into buckets with practiced swings. No one is exempt. Even the matriarch of the household, sitting with needlepoint in a warmed drawing room, knows that a single misstep in the fire's care means a night spent in chill. Still, there is something deeply human in this seasonal symphony. In the way the market reorganizes itself for winter. In the way hands that once picked berries in July now wrap themselves around mugs of broth. In the way families eat not for pleasure alone, but for survival threaded with care. Every meal tells a story of weather, of patience, of planning. A plum pudding at Christmas is not merely dessert. It is the culmination of months of saving, soaking, wrapping. A mince pie is more than tradition. It is memory wrapped in pastry. A stew is not just hot, it is home. And always, the fire continues to burn, fed with the fuel so painstakingly gathered. The two meal and flame exist in tandem, each nourishing the body in its own way. When the bowl is emptied, the fire remains, offering comfort that lingers. And when the fire dies down, the last warmth often comes from within, from food shared, from bellies filled not extravagantly, but sufficiently. As night deepens outside and the windows disappear into darkness, the home draws tighter around itself. The dishes are cleaned and water warmed on the stove. Leftovers, if there are any, are carefully wrapped or left in the cold pantry, where mice are a constant threat and preservation a delicate game. The kettle is refilled and the last logs placed on the fire. In that final hour before bed, the family gathers close again, not out of custom, but of instinct. Cold is a great unifier. It teaches closeness. It teaches gratitude. It reminds even the proud that survival is best done together. And so, in this dance of food and fire, of market and meal, of pot and pan and glowing ember, the Edwardians lived through their winters not with ease, but with deep and quiet dignity. There was no rush, no waste, no excess. Only what was needed, prepared with care, and shared in silence or song or prayer. It was a season of stillness interrupted only by the sounds of soup being stirred, coal being shoveled, a child laughing in the steam of a freshly opened oven. All these things, small and flickering, were the true fuel of winter. And even now, when our stoves light with buttons and our cupboards are never bare, we might still remember the grace of that slower rhythm and feel, in our own bones, the echo of their endurance. If warmth was kindled by flame and sustained by food, then it was worn layered, buttoned, and wrapped in fabric that did more than shield the skin. For the Edwardians, clothing was not simply protection from the cold. It was language. It spoke of class, of propriety, of duty and dignity, and in winter, it was the first and last defense against the long season's unspoken demands. Every article worn was a decision, and every layer told a story, not just of fashion, but of survival, shaped by society's careful expectations. The cold did not equalize, but it did press itself against every shoulder high and low. And those who walked through the fog-dimmed mornings of Edwardian England did, so burdened not only by the weight of wool and tweed, but by the quiet codes of dress that had been passed down like unwritten scripture. The morning began as it always did, with the body emerging reluctantly from bed and clothing, waiting like a promise in the dim light, sometimes folded on a chair near the hearth, sometimes still hanging cold and stiff from a wall peg. Against the skin, the first layers were soft, often made of flannel or brushed cotton. These undergarments were not seen, but they formed the foundation of every ensemble, insulating the body with quiet perseverance. For women, corsets remained a common fixture, even as reformers called for their abandonment, their presence a constant pressure that shaped not just the waist, but the posture, the breath, the bearing. Over that came petticoats, woolen skirts, and tightly laced boots that creaked faintly with each step. A blouse fastened high at the neck, often with a brooch or pin, as if sealing warmth inside the body like a letter waiting to be sent. For men, the dressing process was no less elaborate. A clean shirt, though often starched and unforgiving, was the beginning. Then a waistcoat, always a waistcoat, followed by a heavy wool coat or overcoat when outdoors beckoned. Trousers were made from dense fabric, pressed with care and layered with long socks tucked neatly beneath. Gloves, scarves, and hats were not adornments, but necessities, as much a part of one's appearance as the eyes and the mouth. Yet these layers were more than practical. They were governed by custom, by the gaze of others, by an unspoken insistence that no matter how biting the wind or how deep the snow, one must remain proper, composed, respectable. To dress improperly in winter was not merely an error of judgment. It was a mark of carelessness, a whisper of disorder in a world built carefully upon ritual. And still, practicality whispered its own truth beneath the surface. In every class, warmth was pursued with ingenuity. Wool was the material of the season, thick, insulating, naturally repellent to moisture. Coats were lined with fur, real or faux, and some bore collars so tall they could be turned up against a storm like shields of cloth. Shawls were draped not just for elegance, but for comfort, wrapped and rewound, passed from mother to daughter, worn threadbare over the years. Mittens made from scraps were stitched in the firelight by older hands that remembered other winters. Stockings were layered when the cold deepened. Even newspapers, pressed between waistcoat and shirt, served as hidden armor for those too poor to afford proper lining. These were not eccentricities, but habits born of need. Children wore many of the same layers, scaled down to size, though rarely in good condition. Hand-me-downs were as common as mittens, patched and mended, buttons replaced with string when they vanished in the laundry. Little boots were scuffed and stiff from repeated wettings, and hats rarely stayed in place for long. Yet even the youngest knew the rules of the season. To leave the house with an open collar was to invite admonishment. To forget gloves was to risk both frostbite and a scolding. Warmth was responsibility. Even among play and laughter, children wore the seriousness of winter in the weight of their wool. Among the working poor, clothing carried the same purpose, but often less of the polish. Garments were worn until the fabric thinned to translucence, mended again and again, sleeves shortened or lengthened as bodies grew or shrank. A man might own only one coat, and it would do for both Sunday best and weekday labor. In wet weather, it took days to dry. A woman's shawl might be her only outerwear, wrapped tightly as she hurried between errands or employment, the edges trailing damp across cobblestones. Even so, pride endured. Boots were polished even when cracked. A collar was straightened before entering a shop. There was no indulgence in winter wear-only purpose, and beneath that, a quiet dignity that defied the cold. By contrast, in drawing rooms warmed by firelight and insulated with thick curtains, winter fashion walked a more careful line between style and comfort. Society women displayed an impressive resilience, appearing at teas and musicales in gowns not always suited for the season, their gloves buttoned, their shoes dainty, their expressions composed, despite the chill that crept in from drafty halls. Here, fashion dictated the silhouette hourglass shapes, trailing hems, high collars, all carefully curated, each detail stitched and pinned to perfection. But beneath those layers, warm petticoats hid, and in between carriages and corridors, great cloaks were drawn close, often trimmed with fox or ermine. Servants scurried ahead to warm bedchambers, to lay out dressing gowns beside the grate, to fill hot water bottles and press them between linen sheets. Warmth, for the wealthy, was orchestrated, choreographed, folded into the expectations of class as naturally as silver cutlery or embroidered calling cards. Still, no matter how fine the thread or thick the wool, the season seeped in. Greatcoats grew heavy with sleet. Hats sagged with damp. Gloves grew stiff at the fingers. Even the grandest garments had their limits. And for all the pride in appearance, there was always the private moment when boots came off near the hearth, when shawls were hung near the stove, when fingers red from the cold curled gratefully around a steaming cup. In that moment, everyone was the same, tired, cold, human. And clothing, like fire, became not just function but comfort. The feeling of pulling off wet outerwear and stepping into thick slippers. The rustle of flannel nightgowns as they brushed against old floorboards. The sensation of wrapping a familiar robe around yourself in the quiet of evening, letting it catch the heat of the fire before retreating to the unheated rooms above. These rituals, small and unremarkable, carried the same weight as meals and market trips and letters home. They were the soft armor of the season, worn not with grandeur, but with quiet loyalty. And as the wind howled against panes and the air outside turned to glass, the homes of the Edwardians nestled inward, sealed by fabric and fire. A mother tucked a child's scarf tighter, whispering soft reminders. A father unfolded his greatcoat and laid it carefully by the door to dry for tomorrow. A young girl stitched a tear in her mitten by candlelight, tongue pressed to her lip in concentration. A boy folded his cap into his pocket, his ears still red from the journey home. In these gestures, repeated endlessly across the cities and hamlets, the Edwardians met winter, not with haste or complaint, but with layers of care, sewn and worn with enduring patience. Their clothing was not just fabric, it was the story of how people moved through a world shaped by cold and custom. It was the quiet shield between skin and season. And though time would eventually replace their wool with synthetics, their corsets with elastic, their boots with rubber, and their coats with engineered insulation, something of that rhythm still lingers in the way we wrap ourselves tightly on the coldest nights, in the way we fold the same scarf year after year, in the way the memory of a grandmother's coat still seems warmer than anything bought new. That was the true warmth of Edwardian clothing. Not the thread count, not the fashion, but the familiarity, the knowing, the way winter pressed its hand against the glass. And the Edwardians responded by layering themselves in the same quiet answer. We are still here. Some winters are endured quietly, their hardships passed over in silence and routine, their moments forgotten before the snow even melts. But there are other winters, those softened by pen and memory, that linger far beyond their season. Among the royals of the Edwardian era, there were few voices more quietly vivid than that of Queen Alexandra, consort to King Edward VII. Though the crown weighed heavy and the courts bustled with ceremony, her reflections in winter, captured in fragments of diaries, letters, and remembrances, offer a slower, more private glimpse into a world where royalty too had to rise against the cold wrap fingers around teacups and watch the frost climb the windows just as everyone else did. In the stillness of a long January dusk, even a queen sought warmth beyond jewels or ceremony. And it is there in the hush between royal engagements that Alexandra's winter emerges. Not in state rooms and processions, but in soft candlelight, in rooms thick with the scent of wax and cedar. In the measured silence of a woman who for all her titles still found herself tracing the same rhythms of the season as any other. Born a Danish princess, Alexandra came from a land of snow and sea mist, where winters arrived early and left late, shaping a sensibility both practical and poetic. Even when she stepped into the grandeur of the British monarchy, she carried something of that northern quiet within her, an elegance tempered by humility, a preference for simplicity when surrounded by opulence. Her handwriting, when found, leans delicately across the page, often more sketch than statement, as though her thoughts were intended more for the moment than for history. Yet in the handful of winter entries and correspondence that survive, a clear atmosphere emerges not of empire, but of weather, not of policy, but of light, shadow, silence. For Alexandra, winter was not an obstacle, it was a lens through which life could be seen with greater softness, greater truth. Imagine her now, rising in a palace that groans beneath its own age, its corridors long and cold even in comfort. Sandringham House, in particular her favored retreat in the east of England, held a special kind of winter quiet. The Norfolk wind arrived early there, curling through hedgerows and slipping beneath the cracks in old stone. The estate, sprawling and surrounded by meadows laid bare by frost, seemed less like a place of rule and more like a sanctuary. She often wrote of its trees, skeletal and lovely in the pale light, and of the deer that passed by her window like quiet ghosts. In those letters, there is no mention of Parliament, no echo of coronets or ministers, only the weather, the gardens, the hush of winter walking alongside her like an old friend. Even within palace walls, warmth was elusive. Fires were lit, certainly, and the servants bustled from room to room with coal buckets and warm bricks. But the scale of those old buildings defied heat. Drapes were drawn thick, doors closed tightly, and still the chill settled in like a polite guest who never quite leaves. Alexandra, known for her graceful endurance of pain and her lifelong partial deafness, never complained. Instead, she dressed in wool beneath her gowns, wore shawls even in her private chambers, and placed her feet beside warming pans as she composed her thoughts in longhand. The stillness suited her. While Edward was known for his sociability, his appetite for dinners, cards, and the company of statesman Alexandra often sought the quieter corners. Winter gave her permission to retreat, to write, to think, to breathe. In her diary from the winter of 1905, a year marked by political tension abroad and uncertainty at home, Alexandra describes the snow as a great leveling. She watched the household slow down, the courtiers grow quieter, the garden surrender to white. She wrote simply that even the birds seemed to understand the weight of snow. And with those few words, a whole season opens. For in the world of monarchy, where appearances are curated and voices often filtered, such quiet reflection reveals something deeper. Alexandra was not immune to loss. She had already buried a son, endured the fading of a once close marriage, and seen the weight of kingship grow heavy on a husband whose health was fraying. Winter, then, was not just a season to her. It was a mirror, held calmly before a face that had smiled through ceremony and sorrow alike. When guests arrived at court in the colder months, Alexandra maintained her elegance without fuss. She would greet them in rooms draped in heavy velvet, with silver tea services gleaming beneath gaslight and flowers arranged in colors meant to recall spring. Yet always, there was a layer beneath something Danish, something simple. She preferred walks to carriages, candlelight to chandelier. Her dogs were near always, their warm bodies curled beside her feet as she read or embroidered. In letters to her sister Dagmar, then Empress of Russia, she described her days not in detail, but in temperature, in hours of sunlight, in the way frost feathered the edges of the pond. These letters, often enclosed with dried flowers or sketches, speak not of duty, but of observation of the world as it truly appeared when no one was watching. And always, the season itself seemed to draw her in more deeply than any gala or political concern. In one note, dated simply to January of that same year, she writes of waking to silence, of the way snow transforms even footsteps into whispers. She describes the sound of church bells echoing across the fields, and the sight of Edward standing at the window in his dressing gown, watching the landscape with a look she could not quite describe. There is no elaboration, only the image. A king, a window, the winter beyond. It is enough. For in that single detail, we feel the breath of the room, the quiet tension between power and impermanence, the weight of frost against glass. In her philanthropic work, winter was also a catalyst. Alexandra supported hospitals, homes for widows, and numerous charities that responded specifically to the season's cruelty. She was not loud about it. Her involvement often came through handwritten notes, through parcels sent without ceremony. A pair of boots, a coat for a child, a sum of money enclosed with instructions not to reveal its source. These small acts were her way of tending a wider hearth, of keeping warm those she would never meet. And perhaps that, more than any royal decree, was her truest understanding of winter, that it was not something to conquer, but something to soften, person to person, act by act. Even the way she dressed reflected her understanding of the season's quiet power. While court dress demanded formality, Alexandra's personal winter wardrobe was subdued, favoring deep blues, soft grays, and velvets that held the light like still water. Her jewelry, while exquisite, was often chosen not for its brilliance, but for its history cameos worn like memories, brooches gifted by those long gone. She wore mourning clothes for years after her son's death, even as society moved on, and winter seemed to echo that inner persistence. It gave her the space to grieve gently, without apology, within a world that often expected performance over feeling. And as the Edwardian years crept forward, bringing with them the stirrings of war and change, Alexandra remained a figure of quiet constancy. Her winters, though shadowed by age and sorrow, still held a kind of grace that could not be diminished. In her later diaries, her writing grows smaller, her entries more sparse, but her attention to the season remains. She notes the early blooming of snowdrops, the roughness of wind, the way the light bends differently in February than it does in December. These details, minute and precise, are the markings of a soul still attentive, still listening to the world's softer rhythms. Perhaps the most enduring image of Alexandra in winter is not from a diary, but from a photograph taken near the end of her life. She is seated near a frost-laced window, dressed in black, her hair pulled back, a book open on her lap. The fire beside her glows low, and one of her dogs is curled at her feet. Outside, the garden is bare, the branches silhouetted against a gray sky. She is not looking at the camera. She is looking slightly down, as though the thought she held had just slipped beyond the page. It is a quiet image, but in that quiet lies something profound. The presence of a woman who knew how to inhabit winter, not only with grace, but with stillness, with observation, with memory. And so her diaries, what remains of them, are more than historical documents. They are windows into a royal life lived not only in grandeur, but in softness. They remind us that even queens wake to cold mornings, that they too listen for bells in the silence, that they too wrap shawls around shoulders and press fingertips to frosted panes. Alexandra's winters were not loud. They did not shape borders or rewrite laws, but they endured and they held beauty. In them, we find the gentler echoes of a time too often defined by its pomp and protocol. And in their lingering hush, we are reminded that history, too, has its quieter seasons, best entered slowly, best understood by the warmth left behind when the fire has gone out. In the midst of Edwardian winters that spoke mostly in silence, where lives unfolded beside fireplaces, in quiet parlors or across frost-laced fields, there came a flicker of motion that did not conform to stillness. It did not come with the clang of carriages or the echo of parliamentary speeches, but with the hush of blades on ice, the steady rhythm of breath against frozen air, and the unspoken poetry of bodies in motion. For in the winter of 1908, amidst the calm and custom of a restrained society, sport stepped quietly onto the stage of history, not with fanfare, but with the elegance of purpose. That year, for the first time, the Olympic Games would host events upon the ice, wrapped in Edwardian formality, yet revealing something deeply human beneath. It was not called the Winter Olympics, then not officially, but in London's Prince's Skating Club, the foundations were laid delicate as frost, enduring as flame. The 1908 Olympic Games are most often remembered for their summer pageantry, their grand stadium events, and the curious mishaps that defined early international competition. Yet tucked within that larger narrative is a story not often told, a story set not in sunlight and summer cheers, but in the pale clarity of winter days, under skylights that let snow-filtered light fall gently onto polished ice. In October of that year, the Edwardians hosted the figure skating events of the Games, 4 events in all, each performed in a rink so refined and genteel, it seemed more like a ballroom than an arena. The Prince's Skating Club, located in the well-to-do district of Knightsbridge, bore none of the raucous noise of modern stadiums. It was elegant, enclosed, warmed by civility and the quiet clapping of a society still learning to express admiration through sport. Imagine it now. A long hall of glass and iron, the rink laid smooth as frozen milk beneath the soft illumination of gaslight chandeliers. There is no shouting here, no roar of crowds. The soundscape is composed, instead of muffled blades gliding, of music played from string quartets tucked modestly into the corner, and of the polite applause of men and women dressed as though for a matinee at the opera. Top hats and tailored coats, gloves and furs, the audience is composed, attentive, and quietly uncertain of how to respond to what they are seeing. For the Edwardians, athleticism was not yet spectacle. It was artful discipline. It was extension of the body, restrained by decorum, yet no less daring beneath its surface. And in the center of this muted elegance, the athletes themselves glide, jump, and twirl not in the colors of sponsors or the fire of nationalism, but in high-collared shirts, long skirts, and expressions that speak not of victory but of focus. Madge Sayers, a British skater already crowned in European competitions, moved with such grace across the rink that even the most rigid courtiers found themselves stirred. She had, only 4 years earlier, broken into a sport previously dominated by men, winning not only medals, but the right to compete. At Prince's, she performed not with aggression, but with eloquence, her movements fluid, modest, yet commanding in their control. In her presence, the ice did not seem cold at all. It seemed carved for poetry. Her husband, Edgar Sayers, also competed, his style more reserved, but no less precise. Together, they embodied something rare, a partnership on and off the rink, skating not in rivalry, but in mutual respect. Their routines were measured, gentle, deeply Edwardian in their refusal to rush. And yet, there was bravery in their performance, not the theatrical defiance of modern sport, but a quieter courage, the willingness to present art through physicality in a world still hesitant to reconcile the two. Beyond the couple, other names glimmered faintly through time. Ulrich Salko of Sweden, for whom the jump would later be named, displayed a blend of athletic confidence and understated showmanship, his movements etched across the ice like calligraphy. Richard Johansson, also Swedish, skated with less flair but great strength. And from Germany, skaters brought a new precision to turns and footwork that suggested a coming era of greater technicality. Yet none of them performed for roaring crowds or flashing cameras. They moved instead in a space more intimate than competitive, where each glide was as much for the music, for the moment, as it was for the medal. It is strange, perhaps, to imagine sport in the Edwardian context. The age was one of structure, of hierarchy, of quiet roles understood and rarely questioned. Physical exertion was often associated with labor, and the leisured class preferred to keep their pursuits refined, softened by etiquette. Yet the turn of the century brought with it a slow revolution of movement, a realization that the body could be a vessel, not only of work, but of beauty. Bicycles appeared on streets once reserved for walking. Tennis whites fluttered in the gardens of country houses. Rowing clubs drew crowds on misted riverbanks. And in winter, figure skating still new. Still strange offered a marriage of elegance and power that was not yet fully understood, but already quietly admired. And beneath the grace of it all, the chill of the rink remained constant. The athletes, for all their poise, trained in cold air that bit at fingers and stiffened joints. They arrived in carriages wrapped in scarves, their skates tucked in leather bags. They practiced not before cheering fans, but before quiet observers' coaches, companions, the occasional curious socialite. The ice itself was temperamental, reacting to temperature and humidity. Mist would sometimes rise when too many bodies crowded the viewing stands, blurring visibility, softening the edges of the blade's path. And still, they skated. There was no instant fame, no endorsement deals, no lifetime sponsorships. When the medals were awarded, simple and unadorned compared to today's glittering symbols, there were few journalists, few photographs. The newspapers devoted small columns to the events, speaking of graceful performances and spirited movement, but rarely giving more than a paragraph. And yet, for those who were there, something had changed. A door had opened. Winter had found its rhythm not only in survival, but in expression. In the quiet thrill of watching someone carve circles into silence, balancing strength with stillness, art with effort. Even more quietly, the inclusion of women, still a controversial notion, planted a seed that would grow across decades. Madge Sayers' presence on the Olympic stage was a quiet rebellion, masked in elegance, cloaked in lace. Her skirts brushed the ice, not as hindrance, but as defiance. She was not loud, but she was clear. The ice belonged to anyone who could move with purpose upon it. In that sense, the 1908 events were not a spectacle, but a whisper of what was to come. They marked a turning point, so gentle, it might have gone unnoticed. And perhaps that is why they endure not in the bombast of memory, but in its quietest corners. The kind that returns unbidden when the wind turns cold and you find yourself watching snowfall out a window, imagining what it might be like to step onto a surface so smooth, so pale, and let your body speak where words would not. The Edwardian athlete, then, was not a celebrity. He or she was a craftsman, a performer of slow, deliberate effort. Their world was still bound by formality, their clothing restrictive, their expectations restrained. Yet on the ice, they moved with the beginnings of something freer, something that would, in years to come, give way to jumps and spins that defied gravity, to stadiums that shook with applause. But in 1908, it was quiet, polished, poised. The winter held its breath, and the blades passed over it, soft as thought. And when the performances ended, and the medals were placed, modest medals, hung with ribbons of pale silk, the skaters bowed not just to the judges, but to the audience, to the season, to the stillness that allowed such fleeting beauty. Outside, London exhaled steam from its rooftops, the city unaware that history had just unfolded behind frosted windows and velvet curtains. The carriages rolled away, the ice melted, but something lingered. Even now, more than a century later, The grace of those first Olympic skaters seems to echo in every winter silence. In the hush of snowfall, in the crackle of frost underfoot, in the way we watch a child find their balance on a frozen pond, or the way we turn our faces upward on cold mornings, letting the air bite just a little before we move again. That grace, that discipline, that elegance, they are the inheritance of a moment when sport met stillness, when effort wore a quiet smile, and when winter, for a brief time, became not only survival, but celebration. In the heart of the Edwardian world, there was London vast, layered, and old even then, a city of domes and soot, of gaslight and ambition. But in winter, it changed. As sharp edges of stone and brick softened beneath snowfall, sounds became muffled, and smoke from chimneys hung longer in the frozen air, turning the skyline into something blurred and half-remembered. Beneath this hushed white veil, the capital did not stop. It simply slowed. Horses pulled carriages with greater caution. Policemen stamped their feet at quiet corners. Hawkers called out into fogs that swallowed their words before they reached a second street. And all the while, life continued its rhythm, a strange mixture of regal procession and political unrest, of lavish events cloaked in velvet and of protests forming in the shadows of those very same palace walls. The city moved as a body might, one foot rooted in tradition, the other testing a newer, slipperier path. And over it all, snow fell patient, unbothered by hierarchy or debate. To walk through London in an Edwardian winter was to step into two histories at once. There was the surface well-polished and glittering, carriages gliding past shop fronts, strung with gaslit garlands, gentlemen tipping hats on the steps of gentlemen's clubs, and society women with fur-lined cloaks, stepping from hansoms onto salted pavements trailing perfumes and purpose. Then there was the layer beneath, the quieter, colder pulse of a city coming awake to change. Men in flat caps argued over newspapers in pubs thick with pipe smoke. Women, tired of silence, gathered in small rooms with large ideas. Factories churned on the outskirts, their windows fogged and their workers weary. The divide between these Londons narrowed in winter, not in comfort, but in visibility. Snow covered all roofs equally. It settled on Buckingham Palace, just as it did on Southwark's tenements. And while it did not erase inequality, it made it harder to ignore. In the upper echelons, the season brought its own social calendar. The royal family remained at the center of it, hosts of garden parties turned drawing room affairs, patrons of musical evenings lit by candelabra and hushed applause. King Edward VII, though aging and ailing, still maintained his figurehead status with dignified charm. He presided over events with a practiced ease, his presence more symbolic than decisive, his laughter rich, though often rehearsed. Balls at Marlborough House glowed with soft candlelight and the rustle of silk. The king's appearance at the theater, wrapped in heavy coats and shadowed by his aides, became more than attendance. It was tradition embodied in motion. Royalty in winter walked slower, spoke lower, but remained ever observed. Each nod, each raised hand, each wave from a carriage window beneath falling snow was noted, written about, and whispered between gloved hands. But beneath these spectacles, storms brewed quietly. A cold could not chill the fires of political tension, only veil them for a time. London, in its Edwardian years, was caught between the weight of empire and the murmurs of modernity. The suffragette movement, no longer merely a polite request from drawing rooms, had begun to take to the streets. Women, wrapped in thick shawls and fortified by conviction, marched even in sleet and hail, their voices rising like smoke into the frost-bitten sky. The hunger for change did not hibernate. It pressed onward, undeterred by weather or warning. Meetings were held in icy church basements. Pamphlets were passed hand to hand beneath street lamps made hazy by fog. Snowflakes fell onto banners reading "Votes for Women," and boots crushed slush beneath their protest steps. Elsewhere, labor unrest simmered just beneath the city's polished veneer. Strikes broke out in dockyards and workshops, their participants bundled in coats that barely shielded them from the river wind. The government, meanwhile, teetered on the edge of transformation. The Liberal Party, rising again in strength, pushed for reforms on welfare, on pensions, on land use. The old guard watched warily, reluctant to let go of the structures that had upheld their comfort for so long. Parliament, perched over the Thames like a grand beast, grew warmer inside as tempers rose, as debates stretched deep into the early dark of winter afternoons. Outside, carriages waited with frosted glass, their horses steaming in the cold. Inside, the future of Britain was whispered, argued, resisted, and rewritten page by page, beneath the same snow that dusted every chimney pot in Chelsea and every rooftop in Lambeth. Still, London had a way of containing contradictions. On the same day, a suffragette might be arrested for chaining herself to a railing outside the Houses of Parliament. A royal garden might host a luncheon beneath a crystal canopy warmed by braziers and filled with the scent of imported oranges. On the morning that dock workers lit small fires to warm their hands before a picket line. Society pages in the Times might describe a charity gala in Belgravia, the guests adorned in diamonds, their paths cleared of snow by footmen before they arrived. The city held both truths in its gloved hand, neither dissolving the other, both pressing against one another like cold against glass. And for those who lived in the spaces between clerks, who trudged across Westminster Bridge, each morning governesses who hurried children past slushy crossings, cab drivers who wrapped scarves thrice around their throats, London in winter was simply a matter of endurance. The coal smoke hung lower, the days ended earlier. The pavements froze slick in the alleys and glistened before gas lamps like dark rivers of polished stone. And always there was sound, the crunch of boots on salt, the distant toll of bells from St. Paul's, the whisper of wind threading its way between buildings too old to care. In such a place, time moved as slowly as the snow piled against the garden walls of Kensington, and as steadily as the river flowing dark, patient, and cold beneath the frozen spans of its bridges. Yet there were also moments of extraordinary beauty. Snow fell on Hyde Park, blanketing the statues until they looked like ruins unearthed from some forgotten age. Children, red-cheeked and defiant, built sleds from whatever they could find, crates, trays, even broken bits of furniture, and hurtled down hills with abandon. Lovers walked arm in arm beneath rows of gaslights softened by flurries. Shopkeepers arranged their displays with a kind of stubborn optimism, candles glowing behind misted glass, oranges piled high beside tins of cocoa and ginger. Christmas arrived not with fireworks, but with hymns sung in cold churches, with the warmth of hand-pulled crackers at modest tables, with the silence of families watching the snow fall after the meal had been cleared and the fire poked to life again. Even in its political unease, even in its inequality, London in the Edwardian winter was alive with this duality, elegance and unrest, wealth and want, tradition and transition. The snow did not change the city, it simply revealed it. It made quiet what was usually loud. It made visible what was usually ignored. And in that stillness, the deeper story of the age could be glimpsed, not only in the movements of monarchs or ministers, but in the breath of those who walked beside the frozen fountains, who paused at lamplit crossings, who watched steam curl from their own mouths, and thought, if only for a moment, about where this all might be going. Because London in winter was not a city paused, it was a city listening. Beneath its carriages and protests, beneath its balls and broadsheets, beneath its powdered streets and coal-stoked homes, it heard the creak of the coming century, the slow shift in tone, the early echoes of modern life. And even if most did not name it, they felt it, the weight of what was leaving, and the breath of what was near. The snow, indifferent to both, simply kept falling. Far from London's snow-laced rooftops, and the thick carpets of palace halls. Far beyond the steaming cups by Edwardian hearths, winter unfolded differently, grimmer, quieter, stripped of pageantry, and softened only by memory. For those who stood not at the heart of empire, but at its ragged, wind-blown edge, winter did not arrive with a whisper of snowflakes or candlelit parlors. It came with wind across open terrain, with boots that leaked and fingers gone stiff from the morning watch. It came with silence that was not peaceful, but empty. For soldiers stationed in the outermost reaches of Britain's vast colonial footprint, the cold was not an inconvenience. It was a condition of being. And in their woolen coats and damp socks, in the long hours of frostbitten patrol, and the slow minutes spent beside fires that barely warmed, these men endured not always out of valor, but out of rhythm, out of duty, out of sheer human resolve. It is from their stories, often faint and scattered across time, that a different winter emerges, not crowned or celebrated, but written gently, in ink faded by years and creased by the folds of long journeys home. One such voice, preserved in a letter dated late December 1909, belongs to a Private William Harrow, a name unremarkable among the lists of British soldiers scattered through outposts in South Africa, India, and the Middle East. His hand, neat and formal, spills across a thin sheet of paper, folded twice, the creases worn soft by time. He writes to his sister, not to describe battle, nor hardship, nor victory, but simply to recount the texture of winter on the edge of the world. He is stationed, he says, in the northwest frontier, near Peshawar, a place of wind and sun-baked stone in summer, but now beneath December's thinning sky reduced to something sharp, brittle, and endlessly gray. Imagine him as he writes, hunched beside a flickering oil lamp, the paper balanced across his knee, the tent canvas above him, quivering with wind. Outside, the night has settled coldly on the earth, creeping in through seams and boots and buttonholes. There is no fire, only embers. No roaring hearth, only the slow, reluctant heat of shared breath and shared silence. In his letter, he describes the morning frost, how it settles on the edges of metal cups, how it turns the ground beneath the horses to iron. He notes, without embellishment, that his fingers ache before dawn, and that the thin scarf his mother knitted helps only a little. He says almost apologetically that he misses the smell of coal smoke in their old kitchen and the creak of the floorboards as their father rose before the fire was lit. He writes, not because he expects a reply, but because he must record it, because the act of naming the cold makes it less lonely. And in that act, something intimate appears. His words are not filled with heroism or defiance. They are quiet, patient, and slow. He speaks of the small rituals that mark his days, the tin of tea rationed carefully, the boots repaired with string and wax, the wool socks that no longer match, but still serve. He tells her of the sound the wind makes as it moves between the rocks at night, and how sometimes, when he cannot sleep, he pretends he is back home, back in the small bedroom, with the frost on the inside of the window, the heavy blankets pulled to his chin, and the dog curled at his feet. It is a memory not of comfort, but of knowing, of familiarity, of place. There is no mention of violence in this letter, though surely it was present. The Edwardian Empire, broad and restless, was held together not only by diplomacy, but by force. Posts like his were not peaceful, and yet he does not speak of conflict. He writes instead about weather, about the pale sky at midday, about how the mountains seem to breathe in the cold. He writes about a fellow soldier who has begun carving a chess set from scraps of wood, and how the two of them play under lamplight, their breath fogging the pieces as they move them. He describes a child from the nearby village who brings them eggs sometimes, and how her laugh reminds him of their youngest sister. These moments, woven through the hard fabric of his days, are what sustain him, not honor, not conquest, but the slow pulse of human warmth in a season that offers little. And so his letter becomes a kind of fire-small, flickering, fragile, but enough to draw near to. It offers not a window into empire, but a window into endurance. For every uniformed figure on a recruitment poster, there were dozens like him figures worn not by glory, but by weather, by time, by distance. The British soldier in winter was not a statue. He was a man who stood long hours beneath indifferent skies, who waited for posts that might not come, who shared biscuits grown stale in damp tins. He was not always brave, but he was always there. And in being there, he became something quieter than hero, but perhaps more lasting. A witness. Private Harrow's letter ends without ceremony. He tells his sister to mind her health, to keep the fire burning through January, and to give his best to their neighbor, Mrs. Carr, who made the best jam he's ever tasted. He signs it, "Your brother Will," and beneath that, in smaller script, P.S. Tell Mum the socks helped. That last note lingers, not because it is grand, but because it is human. Because it reminds us that warmth, in winter, does not always come from flame or fur or grand estates. Sometimes it comes from wool sent across oceans, from ink on a page, from the memory of breakfast in a quieter room. There were thousands of such letters, written from Egypt and the Sudan, from the highlands and the Balkans, from wind-lashed islands and frostbitten borders. Most are lost, some remain. Each one, in its own way, describes the same thing. A cold that reaches further than the body. A longing stretched across distance. A life unfolding far from home. And in these, the true nature of Edwardian winter reveals itself not only in the rituals of royalty or the habits of households, but in the breath of a soldier watching the stars from behind a sandbag wall, thinking not of empire, but of a bed that no longer creaks beneath him. The empire itself, for all its might, was subject to winter. Its soldiers might bear flags and weapons, but their coats were the same as any man's woolen, heavy, slow to dry. The cold did not care for insignia. It numbed all fingers the same. It entered tents as easily as it entered palaces. And in that shared silence, even the mightiest force felt the limits of control. And so this letter, folded and fragile, offers not a grand conclusion, but a breath. It reminds us that history, even on the edge of empire, is not only made in battles or treaties. It is made in the way a man writes home on a cold night. In the way he remembers warmth not as comfort, but as place. In the way, beneath stars that belong to no one, he holds a memory close enough to keep from freezing. Long before the Edwardian age came wrapped in the weight of wool and the scent of coal smoke, long before gaslight curled in the corners of drawing rooms, or telegrams flickered across great distances. Winter in the British Isles had another voice, one whispered through hedgerows and wind-blown. Stone paths carried in tailies that drifted like chimney smoke across generations. And though the Edwardians often fancied themselves modern, with their railways and reason, there lingered, still, in the quieter corners of their minds, an old reverence for the unseen forces that winter seemed to summon. The frost was never just frost. The wind that rattled window panes held memory. The snow that blanketed roads and fields did not merely fall. It covered, silenced, obscured. In that hush, stories stirred half-remembered, often softened by time, yet never quite extinguished. And when nights lengthened and firelight flickered against walls, those stories returned not always in words, but in feelings, in glances toward the dark, in hands that drew curtains, just a little tighter in boots, placed with care at thresholds, where cold might enter with more than just a chill. The Edwardians, for all their industry and etiquette, lived in a world where folklore had not yet surrendered. Especially in winter, when the veil between seasons thinned and daylight shortened into something more fragile, there remained a belief, not always spoken, but understood, that nature was not entirely silent, and the frost did not arrive alone. In villages nestled in valleys, and in towns still small enough to remember, the names of every neighbor's stories were passed not through books, but through tone shared by lamplight, over porridge or bread, repeated not for entertainment, but as gentle warnings, as soft explanations, for things that reason did not yet fully explain. A patch of ice too stubborn to melt might be blamed on the breath of Jack Frost, not just a personification of chill, but a trickster, a painter of window panes, a reminder that the world could turn sharp without warning. And if a child wandered too far on a snow-covered path and returned, quiet, cold, and strange, well, there were whispers of things in the woods that moved in the hush, that wore winter like a cloak and did not care for roads or reason. These tales were not always frightening. Some were simply woven into the rhythm of daily life, reminders to pay attention, to respect the land, to prepare. In the north, there was talk of the Barghest and Omen dog, whose breath chilled the ground and whose eyes burned red through fog. In winter, its appearance was taken not as a threat, but as a sign, a marker that something was ending, or beginning, or simply watching. In the fens and moors, will-o'-the-wisps were said to drift lower in the cold, closer to the earth, their faint lights luring travelers off the path. And though Edwardian maps had grown precise, with borders marked and distances measured, there remained places where the roads blurred into wilderness, where no lamp reached, and where a light flickering across the marsh might still tempt the cautious heart into imagining more than mist. Even within homes, the cold seemed to animate the unseen. Floorboards creaked not only from temperature, but from footsteps no longer living. Chimneys groaned in wind, their sounds too deliberate to be merely structural. A sudden crack from the walls, a gust beneath the door, a candle that fluttered without breath nearby. These were not things to name exactly, but they were things to acknowledge. A glance, a pause, a hand resting momentarily on a doorframe. In older households especially, where generations had come and gone beneath the same roof, winter brought not just memory, but presence. Portraits seemed to watch more closely in the low light. Hallways grew longer. Mirrors reflected not only the room, but something of its past, something that stirred when all else was quiet. These sensations were not always met with fear. Sometimes they brought comfort, the sense that one was not alone, even if one was, in every measurable way, solitary. And so it was that superstition became something quieter in Edwardian winter, not shouted or feared, but folded into daily living like another layer of wool. Salt was sprinkled at thresholds, not only to melt ice, but to keep something out. Horseshoes were hung not merely for luck, but because they anchored homes against what moved with the wind. Bells, small and decorative, were tied to doors and drawers, their chimes unneeded but never removed. Even in households that read the Times and hosted rational discussions about empire and science, the old gestures remained, not because they were believed in entirely, but because they had always been done, and winter was not the time to experiment with forgetting. For children, the tales were both comfort and caution. They were told to leave the last crust of bread out at night, not only for birds, but for the wandering souls who might pass through in snow. They were taught to greet the frost on windows with reverence, to trace it gently, but never wipe it away too quickly. A fire left unattended was not just a safety hazard, it might invite something in. Boots had to be placed just so. Curtains drawn before dark. Whistling indoors after sunset was discouraged. The older generations did not always explain why. They didn't have to. The cold itself explained enough. In rural parishes, even churchyards took on a different weight in winter. Snow muffled the outlines of graves, but the stones remained, rising from the white like silent witnesses. The air among them was always a little colder. Candlelit vigils were held more closely, less as ceremony, more as shield. Christmas brought hymns, yes, but also reminders that the world was not only birth and joy, but waiting, watching, dark. And when a death occurred in December or January, the rituals around it seemed slower, deeper, heavier. Mourners walked with a kind of deliberate reverence, their footsteps crisp in snow, their breaths rising in clouds that looked almost like prayers. And after the final words were spoken, many would pause before leaving just for a moment to acknowledge, not the grave alone, but what might linger near it. Even in cities, folklore clung to the cold. In London's narrow lanes, children told stories of faceless women who passed in the fog, their footsteps soundless on wet cobbles. In Yorkshire, tales of black-eyed figures seen near frost-covered gates continued well into the new century. These were not headlines. They were not phenomena. They were simply part of the winter's voice. The season spoke, not in clarity, but in hints. And those who listened really listened, heard it not with the ear, but with something older, an instinct born long before railways, long before gaslight, long before the illusion that all could be known. And so the Edwardians, for all their lace and logic, lived in a world where winter still whispered, where not all that stirred could be seen, where the old stories wrapped in frost and shadow sat beside them in the evening like guests who asked for nothing but silence. These stories were not loud. They were not meant to terrify. They were meant to remind, to pull the heart a little closer to the fire, to close the shutters a little earlier, to listen for what might be walking outside, not in malice, but in memory. For winter, in the end, is a kind of remembering. A season where the world pares itself down, where trees become bone and light becomes rare, and all that remains is what lingers: warmth, habit, story. And in Edwardian times, those stories lived not only in books, but in the breath, between sentences in the glance toward the window. When snow begins to fall in the way, the candle is snuffed just before bed, as if to say, not tonight, not now, not here. And so, when the wind moves against your window and the frost draws its lace across the glass, remember that you are not the first to feel that hush. The Edwardians felt it too, not just in their skin, but in their bones. They wrapped themselves not only in wool, but in words passed down, in rituals preserved through cold nights and quiet years. And in doing so, they made winter not just bearable, but meaningful. When the long dark of winter stretched across the land, and each day arrived late and folded into dusk too soon, there remained, still, among Edwardian villages and hamlets, small fires of joy flickering customs carried forward, not by decree or calendar, but by memory, by repetition, by the hush of tradition wrapped in snow. These were not the grand spectacles of London society balls or the pageantry of royal court, but quieter things, celebrations whose roots ran deeper than names, deeper than history, rooted in the rhythm of the seasons and the unspoken understanding that to endure the winter was not enough. One had to meet it, welcome it, speak softly to it in the language of song and gathering and light. And though many of these traditions faded as the Edwardian era gave way to the machines and motors of modern life, they lingered still in back lanes and parish halls, in hedgerow paths and half-remembered songs hummed by elders near the hearth. They were not just events, they were the shape of time itself, a way of marking the cold not only by absence of sun, but by presence of story. In small villages where fields curled beneath frost and church bells tolled beneath roofs dusted in snow, winter did not arrive in silence. It was ushered in with hands that hung greenery in entryways and windows, with carols sung not to perform, but to preserve. The season was a passage, a turning of the world inward, and the people moved through it together. Among the hedgerows and stone walls of the countryside, ancient customs lingered beneath Edwardian lace, still vibrant in places where gaslight had not yet dimmed the stars. The wassail, for instance, survived in cider-rich corners of the West Country, an old rite of orchard and spirit, in which villagers gathered in dark and frost to bless the trees that would bear fruit once more. Bundled in coats, carrying lanterns and bowls of steaming drink, they sang to the apple trees, poured cider on their roots, and hung toast in their branches for the robin's charming offerings to awaken life buried under sleep. It was not superstition so much as relationship, a promise to the land, a gesture of gratitude, a declaration that winter would not erase the memory of growth. In northern villages, mummers still appeared from shadowy barns and dim-lit inns, players wrapped in costume and mischief, performing half-familiar plays that bore echoes of medieval rhythm and ancient ritual. St. George and the Dragon, the doctor who revives the slain, the quarrel between Old Man Winter and the youthful Spring. These performances, rough and unscripted, were never truly forgotten, only softened by time, their edges smoothed by the repetition of generations. Men who spent their days with soil beneath their nails would don strange garb and speak in rhymes that made little sense and all the sense in the world. Theirs was a theater of frost and firelight, performed in kitchens and yards, fueled by ale and laughter, and always ending in shared bread, shared drink, and the knowing warmth of community gathered against the cold. There were other festivals too, some lit by memory more than fire. Candlemas, though no longer a holiday of state or law, still burned gently in February windows, marking the midpoint between solstice and spring. In churches, beeswax was blessed, its golden scent folding into the breath of hymns, and candles were lit not for show, but for promise, for the return of light, for the hope that winter's grip might soon loosen. And though the rites had Christian names, their bones were older, woven from the ancient impulse to honor the turn of the earth with ritual and quiet joy. Even Christmas itself, as celebrated by Edwardians beyond the grandeur of cities, bore traces of something deeper than tinsel or turkey. In villages dusted with snow and lined with ivy-covered cottages, it was a season of visitation, of fire tending, of silence between songs. Families gathered not for excess, but for presence. Oranges, rare and fragrant, were passed hand to hand with reverence. Bread was broken slowly. Children recited poems by candlelight, their voices high and earnest. The tree, cut from a nearby wood or gifted by a generous landowner, stood not in a cascade of ornaments, but in a coat of paper garlands, tallow candles, and small handmade gifts tucked carefully beneath. The scent of pine, the sound of footsteps on old floorboards, the rustle of wrapping made from last year's paper, these were the textures of celebration, not loud, but lasting. At Twelfth Night, long after the guests had gone, and the days began their reluctant stretch toward, spring songs still drifted from house to house, carried by small groups of singers, who wrapped their tunes in wool and harmonies, passed down like heirlooms. The songs were not always joyful, some carried melancholy, the sadness of endings, the ache of another year past, but they were sung with the knowledge that sorrow, too, had its place in the turning of the seasons. A good year did not mean an easy one, and even joy in winter, or a kind of quiet wait. In the highlands and islands of Scotland, fire festivals glowed through the snow and dark, the burning of old boats, the lighting of torches. Men in costume, their faces flickering with flame, walked through towns and hamlets as if drawing the past into the present with each footstep. These were not spectacles for tourists or cameras. They were ceremonies of place, born of weather and wind, of sea and salt, and the knowledge that life clings best when it is warmed from within. Even in cities, where cobblestones rang with hoofbeats and fog pressed against glass like breath on skin, the village spirit was not entirely gone. In East End alleyways and quiet church halls, neighbors gathered in winter for penny concerts and shared tea, for raffles and charades and songs sung off-key with smiles. Celebrations did not require grand expense-only presence. Only people willing to be near one another when the world grew cold. And though electric bulbs had begun to glow in some streets, and phonographs echoed in parlors, there remained a reverence for the spoken word, the gathered voice, the ritual of warmth made together. These celebrations, though small, were never minor. They were the heartbeat of winter, steady, soft, and persistent. They were not kept alive by record, but by rhythm, by mothers teaching daughters the words to a song, by neighbors lending spices for a cake, by church bells ringing not just to call the faithful, but to remind the weary that time still moved and spring would come. They were not grand, but they were held in the hands of the many, and in being held, they endured, even when the age that birthed them faded. Today, few of these customs remain as they once were. The mummers no longer knock on every door. The wassail bowls are fewer. The songs are remembered in fragments, hummed perhaps by those who do not know their names. But if you walk through a village on a cold December night, you may still hear something in echo, a footstep, a warmth that is not heat but memory, a candle in a window, a wreath that feels older than the century, a gathering where no one speaks of history, but everyone feels it. These are the remnants, the embers of Edwardian winter's soul, not lost, only quieter. And so, in the softness of these village festivals, in the hum of celebration beneath snow-covered roofs, the Edwardians did something rare. They did not fight the season, they joined it. They met the cold not with resistance, but with rhythm, with song, with stories that did not need explanation to be understood. And in that joining, they wove winter not as absence, but as presence, not as silence, but as harmony. A long, slow song meant not to dazzle, but to hold, to remind, to warm. And perhaps, if you listen closely, you can still hear it. The echo of bells, the crunch of boots over snow, a voice in the dark that begins to sing. Snow, to the Edwardian imagination, was more than weather. It was a presence, a transformation, a slow quieting of the world that seemed to arrive not from the clouds alone, but from somewhere older, more deliberate. It softened rooftops, erased footprints, and turned familiar fields into white oceans without boundary or map. And yet beneath its beauty, beneath the hush it cast upon cities and hamlets alike, there stirred another impulse, not poetic, but observational. Curiosity, precise and quietly relentless. While some warmed themselves by fires and marked snowfall only by boots wetting the floorboards, others stood in coats too thin for the hour, peering into glass instruments and scribbling in small notebooks, wondering not only when snow might fall, but why it did so at all. For even as the Edwardian age clung to its traditions and told stories lit by firelight, it was also a time of close observation, of glass lenses and brass compasses, of curiosity cabinets filled with frost-bitten specimens and snowflakes drawn in careful hand. Science had come to winter, not to conquer it, but to name it, to understand its shape. In the quiet back rooms of country estates and in the observatories, tucked high above gaslit streets, gentlemen and hobbyists alike turned their attention skyward. Meteorology, still young, still clinging to the edge of formal science, was not yet a precise discipline. It was part measurement, part interpretation, part habit. The Royal Meteorological Society, just decades old, published reports that mingled temperature readings with detailed personal observations. Snow depths recorded with ruler and pencil, sketches of clouds labeled with Latin names, theories about atmospheric pressure scribbled in margins and mailed to colleagues by post. Barometers hung near kitchen doors. Thermometers leaned near window sills. Rain gauges and snow traps were carefully set in gardens, checked each morning with the same devotion others gave to the prayer book or postman's knock. It was a different kind of worship, one offered not to gods, but to patterns, to frost, to the wide breathing of the sky. And snow, in particular, drew fascination. It arrived suddenly, changed everything, and vanished. It was silent and strange, soft yet sharp, delicate yet destructive. Edwardian scientists, often dressed in greatcoats and woolen scarves, would pause in garden paths or churchyards to catch flakes on dark cloth, marveling at their intricacy. Without photography, many relied on sketching, and in their notebooks, small leather-bound, corners curled from yews are pages of snowflakes drawn like lace, like flowers, like six-armed stars forged in silence. Each one a miracle, gone before it could be named. Some inspired by American naturalist Wilson Bentley, who had begun photographing snow crystals across the Atlantic, tried to replicate his method, freezing their fingers as they adjusted early cameras, hoping to preserve a single flake's fleeting geometry before it melted under breath or warmth. In schools and lecture halls, snow was studied not only as beauty but as behavior, its density, its layering, its potential to insulate or to bury. Children learned to measure depth, to mark changes, to note when the air smelled like snow, an observation considered both poetic and precise. Teachers would bring in bowls of snow to watch them melt in the warmth of the classroom, discussing latent heat and water cycles, while children leaned forward with wide eyes, watching the line of wetness crawl slowly across the bowl's edge. It was not spectacle. It was participation, a kind of quiet partnership between child and season. And in drawing rooms, curiosity bloomed in gentler ways. The Edwardian affection for the cabinet of curiosities, a place where the natural world could be brought indoors. Observed, admired meant that winter, too, had its specimens. Pine cones dusted with snow, pressed ferns turned fragile in frost, vials of meltwater, clear as glass, labeled with date and location. Even frost itself, impossible to capture, was honored through painting, through poetry, through the repeated act of watching. At the edge of windows, where the cold met breath, delicate tendrils of ice grew like ferns, curling into patterns that no hand could replicate. Children traced them with fingers, and some more careful, more curious copied them into sketchbooks, wondering how something so temporary could feel so perfect. The homes of the scientific elite, meanwhile, held larger tools, hygrometers, anemometers, Stevenson screens tucked in gardens behind brick walls. But even these measured devices did not strip snow of mystery. One could know the dew point and still be surprised by the softness of a snowfall. One could chart a storm as arrival and still be hushed by the way it blanketed the earth in quiet. Science in this age did not always seek to explain away. It sought to name with reverence. There was space still for wonder, and perhaps the clearest expression of that wonder lay in the journals kept not for publication, but for personal preservation. Many Edwardians, particularly those in the countryside, kept weather diaries. Each entry a record, sometimes a single line. Snow began at dawn. No sun today. Wind from the east. Frost deepened. Chickens stayed close to coop. These observations were small, repetitive, and utterly human. They marked the days as one might mark beads on a rosary, each a step through something larger, each a reminder of time's slow, unfolding rhythm. And over years, these diaries became more than just logs of temperature and snow. They became family records, echoes of seasons past, anchors in memory. Still, not all was calm. The science of snow had practical applications, and Edwardians knew the danger beneath its quiet. Railways halted by drifts. Telegraph wires snapped beneath weight. Food shortages in rural towns. Avalanches in northern territories. And so forecasting, still clumsy, became a priority. Observers sent telegrams to London, reporting snowfall in distant counties. The London Meteorological Office issued warnings, slow, uncertain, but improving. And when storms struck, headlines echoed their arrival, often with language more literary than technical. A white silence covers the north, one paper declared. The frost reigns still, another wrote. Even the facts bent toward metaphor, because the science of snow was never entirely about numbers. It was about presence, about the feeling that the world had changed overnight, not just in landscape, but in tone. And so snow became a bridge between science and soul, between measurement and meaning. It was studied, yes, but also felt. And in feeling it, Edwardians participated in something older than empire, older than knowledge. They became witnesses to a language spoken not in words, but in crystals. Not in certainty, but in softness. A flake falls not because we predict it, but because the sky has chosen silence. A child cups it in gloved hands, not to understand it, but to behold it. A man writes in his journal, not to prove a theory, but to mark a moment, to say, here it snowed. Here the world changed. And so in curiosity cabinets and frost-sketched margins, in wax-sealed journals and quiet schoolrooms, the science of snow took root not to tame winter, but to notice it, to sit beside it, like one sits beside a quiet fire, and ask not with urgency, but with wonder what it means that something so cold can be so beautiful, that something so fleeting can feel eternal. And perhaps that is the truest lesson of snow, not what it tells us, but how it teaches us to listen. Winter, though often associated with stillness and the long hush of sleep, has always had a peculiar way of revealing what lies hidden. In the Edwardian imagination, shaped by both rational inquiry and a deep respect for mystery, this quiet season was not only one of retreat and preservation, but sometimes unexpectedly of unearthing. Beneath the snow, under frost-cracked soil, and among the skeletal remains of withered hedgerows, stories waited to be found, not in books, but in the ground, in attics, in fields gone dormant. And so, while much of the world drew inward, warmed itself by firelight, and counted the slow days until spring, there were some who ventured out, not always seeking treasure, but encountering it nonetheless. Surprised by history whispered back in fragments of stone, glass, and rust. These were not grand expeditions or announcements with fanfare, but quiet discoveries, often stumbled upon in winter's pause when the earth, bare and brittle, seemed willing to show something of what it remembered. It was in these months, when the brambles no longer clawed and the undergrowth lay flat, when rivers ran slower and the low sun cast shadows in new angles, that shepherds and farmers, children and clergymen, found themselves drawn toward shapes and gleams that had not been there before. A turn of the soil in a frosted field revealed more than root or worm sometimes. It was the curve of a Roman coin, dulled by centuries, but still stamped with an emperor's profile, emerging like a face in a dream. Sometimes it was the glint of glass, not the smooth, familiar kind of window or bottle, but something ancient, bubbled with time, green-tinted and oddly shaped. There were iron nails longer than any carpenter now used, and brooches nestled in clumps of dirt, their pins still sharp, their designs curled like frost patterns on the window. And there were bones, not always human, not always named, but always suggestive, always stirring a breath of curiosity deeper than explanation could satisfy. These finds were often accidental. A farmer clearing rocks from a frozen pasture, a boy idling near the edge of a stream, breaking ice with his boot, a mason patching a stone wall, dislodging a piece that fell away to reveal a hollow space one that had been waiting, perhaps for decades, perhaps for centuries. The discoveries weren't dramatic. They didn't shout. They didn't glow. But they changed something, gently, in the one who found them. There is a particular stillness that follows the unearthing of such things, not silence exactly, but a pause, as if the earth itself is acknowledging the reveal. A breath held, a name almost spoken. And so, in the Edwardian countryside, winter became a kind of archaeologist, not because it dug, but because it laid bare. In the softened edges of frostbitten ruins, in the sagging stone circles, suddenly more visible without their summer veils of vine and leaf, there appeared echoes of lives once lived. Churchyards revealed older markers. Walls, cracked by ice, fell away in pieces that told of earlier hands, earlier homes. Even in towns, where the rhythm of life continued through railway and market, winter sometimes peeled back the layers. Old shop signs reappeared beneath flaking paint. Cobblestones hidden under layers of modern streetwork shone through where snow was shoveled away. In these brief windows, the past stepped forward, not loudly, but insistently. Among those most attentive to such moments were the antiquarians, men and women who, with notebooks in coat pockets and eyes trained to the ground, wandered the countryside not with spades and shovels, but with curiosity. Their interest was not always academic. Some collected for cabinets, others for personal wonder. Some sketched what they found and left it where it was. Others, more formal, reported their discoveries to local museums or societies where the artifacts were cleaned, catalogued, and quietly displayed behind glass. There was no urgency, only care. The act of finding was enough. It proved, in its way, that time could fold, that the ancient did not vanish, but waited, patient, for a season when the world grew quiet enough to notice. In some cases, what was found changed how people saw their place entirely. A burial mound mistaken for a hillock revealed a Bronze Age resting place, uncovered when winter erosion carried away the topsoil, just enough to show the rim of a bowl, the glint of a bead. A frozen bog, usually impassable, cracked under the weight of a cart, revealing timber laid in a pattern evidence of an old road or a forgotten structure, submerged for generations. And once in Norfolk, a boy chasing a dog into a derelict barn stumbled into a pit where fragments of pottery had been dumped, still dusted with soot still warm, with the handprints of those who'd shaped them centuries before. His family told no one for weeks, unsure of what to do, afraid it might bring strangers or fuss. But when they finally brought the local vicar to see the barn, became a site of fascination, not a dig site in the modern sense, but a place visited with reverence, with wrapped packages of tea cakes and sketch pads in gloved hands. The discoveries were not only physical. Winter's quiet had a way of unearthing memory as well. Elderly villagers, long silent about the past, would grow reflective by the fire, speaking softly of things once told to them as children. A ruined building, seen through bare trees, would stir the story of a fire, or a family who vanished, or a traveler who left a gift and was never seen again. These tales, half lost in summer chatter, returned in the stillness of snow. They became part of the season's texture, unearthed not from soil, but from within. And within homes, especially those long-lived in winter, sometimes revealed artifacts not buried, but forgotten. In cellars gone cold, in attics opened for the first time in years to find extra blankets or candle stubs, boxes were found. Letters bound in twine, their ink faded. Books with pressed flowers between pages. A pair of spectacles with lenses still clear. A hand mirror, cracked, but catching firelight with the same shimmer as ever. These were not museum pieces. They were fragments of personal time objects that had belonged, and then drifted into the hush, waiting for rediscovery. No fanfare, no plaque, only memory, blinking back into the room. The Edwardians, in their way, understood that not all history was behind them. Some of it still lingered beneath their feet, behind their walls, within the folds of their daily life. Winter, with its quietude and slow passage, offered space to see it, and in seeing it, to remember that the past is never truly gone. It is only resting, waiting for the right moment, for the right silence, for the right kind of snow. And so the artifacts uncovered in winter's quiet were not always dramatic. They were not golden. They were not grand, but they were real. And in their reality, they offered something perhaps more precious than treasure: continuity. A thread, cold to the touch, but strong, linking the present to all the lives once lived in the same places, under the same skies, beside the same firelight. They whispered, without need for voice, "We were here. We are still here. You have found us, and in finding, you remember." There is a certain hush that belongs only to the Edwardian drawing room in winter, a quiet not born of stillness, but of security. It is the hush of fire crackling in a marble hearth, of tea being poured without urgency, of pages turned softly beneath the filtered light of a shaded lamp. Outside, the cold presses gently at the windows, laying its chill across glass panes like a forgotten visitor seeking entry. But it does not come in, not here. For in these rooms enclosed by thick velvet curtains, insulated by wainscoting and years of accumulated comfort, winter is held at bay. Not defeated, but distanced. It is admired from behind lace and mullion, where the falling snow becomes scenery and not sentence. And so, in this protected world, warmth becomes more than physical. It becomes an atmosphere, a rite, a rhythm of life that moves slowly, deliberately, without interruption. To step into such a room in Edwardian England was to enter not only shelter from the cold, but from the urgency of the outside world. The drawing room was curated carefully, not simply furnished, but composed, as one might compose a quiet piece of music. Every element was intended to soothe, to speak softly of order and refinement. The settee arranged just so before the fire. The cabinet of curiosities, aglow with the glint of polished ivory and glass. The grandfather clock ticking in deliberate beats that made the hours feel longer than they were. Thick rugs softened the floorboards, and embroidered cushions bore the impression of countless afternoons passed in gentle conversation or none at all. Here, in the warm corners of the gentry's life, leisure was not idleness. It was its own form of labor, one built upon generations of wealth and the unseen work of others. Tea did not simply appear, it was brought. The fire did not feed itself. Someone had carried coal before the sun had risen. Yet to those seated within, the lady knitting by the hearth, the gentleman lost in his newspaper, the guest resting her gloved hands upon her lap, this comfort was effortless, even expected. It was the rhythm they had inherited, the condition into which they were born. Their winters were marked not by struggle, but by stillness, by the gentle rotation of season and society, by visits and letters, by music played faintly on the piano as twilight crept in early. And within this warmth, time softened. Mornings lingered longer over breakfast served on porcelain. Afternoons stretched themselves thin across novels half read, embroidery left unfinished in laps, and fireplaces replenished before they cooled. Conversations were unhurried, meandering from one topic to the next, with no aim but companionship. Even silence was considered comfortable, woven into the very fabric of these rooms, like the fringe of the curtains or the folds in the damask. There was no need for noise when the fire spoke in embers and the ticking clock held the room steady. The drawing room in winter was also a theater of appearances. Guests arriving from the cold, faces flushed from the air, fingers tingling from the carriage ride, were met with warmth, not only in heat, but in hospitality. Gloves removed carefully, coats taken by a silent servant, a place offered by the hearth. There was an art to hosting in such spaces, one not measured in lavishness, but in ease, the way the tea tray was already laid when it should be, the way the room itself welcomed without command. Children, if present, were taught to speak when spoken to sit quietly, to observe. They absorbed the warmth not only through layers of wool, but through the practiced civility that governed every exchange. Yet for all its comfort, the drawing room was also a boundary. Outside its doors, the cold continued. The servants who tended to the fire returned to unheated quarters. The coal had to be carried through wind and sleet. The horses, though stabled, knew no luxury. And so the warmth within these rooms was not merely about insulation, it was about insulation from the real. It was a privilege that blurred hardship into scenery. Snow became picturesque. Hunger remained hypothetical. The cold was spoken of gently, as a curiosity, not a companion. Still, there was humanity here. The drawing room was not immune to sorrow, only better dressed for it. Letters arrived bearing news that chilled the room more than any wind. Guests withdrew early after quiet words. Morning crept in through even the warmest walls, but the rituals endured. The fire was banked. The tea was brewed. The armchair remained. And so, in these spaces, grief became manageable, domesticated, softened by the familiarity of place. And while the world outside edged toward modernity, trains and votes, factories and reforms, the drawing room held to its rhythm. It was a space that remembered not only the stories of those who had sat there before, but the very notion that winter, like life itself, could be made gentle if one only arranged the room just so. That a shawl over the knees, a good novel, and a cup of something warm could hold back even the deepest cold, at least for a little while. The Edwardian drawing room, then, was not simply a place. It was a season within a season. A curated winter, one made bearable through lineage and leisure. And in its warmth, we find not only comfort, but contrast. For while some warmed their hands by the fire, others warmed their hands by breath alone. While some watched the snow fall with contented sighs, others walked through it with heads bowed low, boots leaking, coats thin. The fire in this room spoke of more than heat. It spoke of inheritance, of the invisible architecture of comfort. And yet, as history turns, even the warmest rooms change. The drawing rooms of the Edwardians would, in time, empty. The wars would come. The coal would grow scarce. The houses, too large to keep, would be sold or subdivided. The curtains drawn against winter would be drawn no longer. But in memory, they remain those rooms where firelight danced on polished wood, where steam curled from porcelain, where winter knocked gently at the window and was told softly, "Not today." Beneath the soft glow of the drawing room, and beyond the echo of teacups placed gently upon saucers, there stretched a world far colder, far harder, and altogether more indifferent. The Edwardian factory, vast, bricked, and always awake, did not stop for the season. Its machinery turned as relentlessly in December as it did in May, each cog and wheel immune to the frost biting at the windows. Within its cavernous walls, the air hung heavy, not with warmth, but with vapor, the condensation of human breath in freezing spaces where bodies moved from duty, not desire. Here, there was no fire crackling in a hearth, only the steady rhythm of iron upon iron, the bark of foremen echoing down damp corridors, and the unrelenting cough of workers who knew the taste of coal dust better than bread. They arrived before dawn, these men and women of the soot-lined streets, drawn from the chill of alleys and the gray breath of cramped homes with little insulation. The path to the factory was not a walk, but a ritual of endurance. Boots, often cracked, found their grip along icy cobblestones slick with last night's frost. Fingers remained clenched in pockets, not out of habit, but necessity, holding on to what heat they could hoard. Children, some no older than 10, shuffled behind their elders, eyes blinking against the bitter air, not yet knowing the weight of years, but already bearing the weight of expectation. Work was not an option. It was breath itself. Inside, the chill did not relent. Factories were not built for comfort, only for production. Stone floors leached heat from the body, and windows high above allowed in light, but not warmth. The great machines radiated no heat, only noise and danger. Workers wore layers when they could, though wool was dear and coats heavy. They moved quickly not to meet quotas, but to stay warm. Each movement, each repetition of task, became a small battle against the creeping cold in their bones. And yet they endured. Not stoically, perhaps, but silently, their breath misting in the air like fleeting ghosts of resilience. Lunch brought no relief, only a pause. Meals were eaten quickly in corners, or beside unlit stoves, hands trembling not from age, but from cold that had settled deep into the joints. Sometimes there was soup, thin and steaming, passed in tins that retained warmth for mere minutes. Sometimes bread, sometimes nothing. Conversations were quiet, conserving energy. Laughter, if it came, sounded like something unfamiliar in this place. But still, it came the kind of laughter born not from joy, but from defiance, from the human refusal to let even winter win entirely. Evenings were not easier. When the final bell rang, the workers spilled out into the darkness that had already claimed the day. Snow fell silently, softening the edges of the harsh world, but offering little mercy. Home was not far, But each step was made slower by the ache of labor, the protest of knees, the longing for heat that did not wait for them. Fires were rare. Coal cost money. Often, warmth came from bodies huddled together beneath blankets made of old coats, old shirts, old hopes stitched into patchwork against the cold. And within those tenements and terraces, where heat fled through every crack and breath turned to frost, there existed a quiet code of survival. Neighbors shared more than walls. They shared coals, crusts, and sometimes conversation through the floorboards. Children learned early to wrap their feet in rags and sleep close to siblings. Mothers boiled water not to cook, but to warm the air, if only for an hour. And yet, the rhythm continued. Morning would come again. The factory would wait. Still, not all was grim. Even within these frigid walls, life bloomed in small, stubborn ways. A song hummed beneath the hiss of steam. A hand extended with a crust of bread. A scarf shared. A story whispered. These were the moments that filled the silences between noise and need. Moments that made the unbearable simply endured. And when spring eventually returned, and it always did, it was not met with celebration, but with exhalation. The cold had not claimed them this time. They had survived, and that, in itself, was enough. The morning began not with the rustle of enthusiasm, but with the sound of frozen boots dragging across brittle paths, small feet too tired to lift themselves in the weight of winter. School for the children of Edwardian England was not always a place of eager discovery. In the deep grip of winter, it became another place of endurance, a kind of quiet battlefield between the cold and the courage of youth. The buildings that housed their learning stood gray and tall, stone-faced and unmoved by the seasons, and as children approached them, their breath rose in white wisps that vanished into the heavy air. Books were carried beneath arms not only for learning, but for warmth. Pages curled and corners softened from the moisture of persistent frost. Inside, the air was still, heavy, not with warmth, but with a chill that wrapped around the ribs and settled beneath the fingernails. Coal fires, if they burned at all, crackled softly in iron grates that could never quite chase away the vastness of the cold. The heat reached those closest to it, leaving others to sit stiffly in their wooden desks, ink frozen in its wells, fingers numb upon slates. Teachers, themselves bundled in shawls and gloves, taught through their own shivering. There was no indulgence in these spaces, only instruction wrapped in breath, visible between sentences. And through it all, the children remained hunched, attentive, hopeful. The children wrapped in coats that were often their only layer between themselves and the winter, learned not just arithmetic or grammar, but how to ignore the trembling of limbs, how to sit still when every instinct called for movement to stay warm. The smell of coal dust mingled with the dampness of wool, the echo of the teacher's chalk occasionally broken by a cough or a sniffle. Still, they came, they sat, they listened, not always understanding, not always focused, but always present. Attendance was more than just a record. It was a testament to fortitude, a quiet badge of perseverance worn beneath mittens and mufflers. For many, school was more than education. It was warmth, sometimes the only place where a fire was lit. It was a place where bread was shared, where a teacher might notice a fading child and slip a biscuit into a pocket. These small gestures stitched a kind of quiet kindness into the fabric of hardship. And on certain days, if the snow fell too thick or the pipes burst with ice, school would be cancelled, and a cheer might rise. Cheer not of joy, but of release from the obligation of stillness in the cold. Yet for most, even a frigid classroom was better than the four walls of a cold home, where hunger waited more eagerly than any chalkboard lesson. Even so, education in the Edwardian winter carried with it a resilience that echoed that of the factories and the homes. A determination to learn, to hope, to climb, however, slowly toward something warmer than the world they knew. For the children of the working class, every letter learned, every number mastered, was a kind of rebellion against the cold fate that had been handed down. It was not glamorous. It was not easy. But it was something. And long after the lessons had faded and the classrooms had crumbled, that quiet resistance lingered, like the memory of breath on a windowpane, fragile, fleeting, but undeniably real. The streets of Edwardian England, glazed in frost and silenced by snow, held within them two different winters. One clothed in cashmere and satin, the other in threadbare wool and hope. There, behind the lace-curtained windows of the affluent, warmth pooled like honey, rich and slow, drawn from coal deliveries that arrived on time and fireplaces that never went cold. The drawing rooms of Belgravia and Mayfair knew winter as something poetic, a season to be admired from a window, with tea in china cups and slippers by the grate. In these homes, winter was softened by upholstery, by velvet drapes that held back the chill and gas lamps that glowed amber through the dusk. There was leisure, and within leisure, protection. The children of wealth still studied, but in heated rooms, with private tutors and soft ink that never froze in its pot. For them, winter was a change in wardrobe and scenery, not a test of endurance. But beyond the carriage routes and manicured squares, another winter unfolded in a language of survival. The poor did not escape to country estates or find refuge in seaside sanatoriums. Their winters were static, rooted in soot streaked cities and villages, where the sun's rare appearance was not poetic, but necessary. The working classes, the widows, the elderly, and the orphaned, they braved winter not as a seasonal guest, but as a threat. Their fires were rationed, their blankets shared, their boots often soaked through with slush that turned to ice by morning. Cold did not just touch them. It wrapped itself around them like a second skin, a silent adversary that demanded daily confrontation. This divide was not simply economic, it was atmospheric. A woman in Chelsea might write letters beside a crackling fire, her ink flowing freely, her fingers bare. Another, in the East End, could barely move her pen without gloves, her handwriting stiff, her breath clouding the paper. Even their words were shaped differently, not only by vocabulary, but by condition. The wealthy wrote about longing and leisure, the poor about illness, eviction, and debt. The divide between these winters was not abstract, it was tactile, as real as the difference between boiled potatoes and roast goose, between a fur muff and a threadbare scarf. Yet both winters coexisted, often within walking distance, each unaware or perhaps deliberately ignorant of the other's truth. Charities emerged, yes, and coal tickets were handed out, but these were fleeting comforts, not systemic bridges. The Edwardian winter was not one season, but two narratives, parallel and unblended. One glistened with holiday cards and parlor games. The other, dimly lit, whispered stories of cold floors and colder futures. And even now, as we pull blankets up around our shoulders and listen to history with warm breath and soft beds beneath us, the echo of that divide remains not to shame, but to remind that warmth, like wealth, was never equally shared. But memory can be, and in remembering gently, we carry their stories forward into the quiet of night. And now, the long Edwardian winter draws to a close not in their time, but in ours. The flickering lamps of drawing rooms and coal-scented alleyways dim once more in the hush of history, as we gently ease ourselves back from cobbled lanes and frost-stiffened gloves to the comfort of our present. What we have wandered through together was not simply a season, but a texture of life. A tapestry woven with coal smoke and wool, with ink and ice, with silence and resilience. Each thread belonging to a person, a story, a fleeting moment that once was, and now only lingers in memory. As we rest here, wrapped in quiet, their footsteps still echo faintly on frozen cobblestones. Their breath still hangs in the air, like faint mist on a morning window. They do not speak loudly. The Edwardians never really did. Their voices carry in the crackle of firewood, in the scratch of a nib across a school slate, in the distant chime of bells over snow. There is something hauntingly tender in looking back. Not with sorrow or sentimentality, but with stillness, the kind that understands. The kind that observes how a people, so far removed from screens and signals and central heat, crafted lives against the elements. Some were born to wool-lined cradles, others into cold basins by soot-smudged windows. But all of them learned the rituals of winter, each in their own way. In kitchens, hearths burned low and steady, a quiet rebellion against the season's blunt indifference. In fields and sheds, fingers fumbled with frozen tools while breath coiled in clouds. In classrooms and cathedrals, in royal courts and village inns, the story remained the same: to endure, to warm each other when the fire was not enough, to carry a piece of warmth not only in cloth, but in company, in kindness, in the slow continuity of days. And so now, you might let your mind drift gently over the landscape we've passed. From Queen Alexandra's private recollections to the clatter of coal carts in the East End, from the chill of frozen schoolrooms to the forgotten joy of village festivals, long faded into folklore. You've walked among athletes and archivists, soldiers and seamstresses, children and chimney sweeps. You've wandered between worlds that rarely met, save for in stories. And perhaps, in this soft remembering, you've come to know not only their winters, but your own a little better. For winter, after all, is not just a season of the calendar. It is a season of the soul. It visits all of us, sometimes in snow, sometimes in silence. And in each age, the warmth we find is not always in what we own, but in what we offer. The shared blanket, the passed down tale, the simple presence of another heart nearby. So now, as you settle into your rest, your own fire low, the air quiet, your breath slow and easy, know that you carry with you something older than comfort, older even than sleep. You carry a memory, a quiet understanding, and somewhere within that gentle hush, the Edwardians rest again too, not in the frost of their time, but in the warmth of ours. Good night.